The Christmas Eve blizzard hammered Montana with merciless fury, driving rancher Jake Sullivan through waist-deep snow toward his barn to check on the livestock one final time before the storm buried everything under white silence. He climbed the ladder to inspect the hayloft for roof damage, and froze when his lantern revealed a figure huddled in the corner, a young woman wrapped in a torn shawl, her lips blue from cold, dark hair dusted with snow that had blown through the gaps in the wooden boards. Her wide, terrified eyes fixed on him like a cornered animal as she whispered desperately, "Please don't hurt me." Jake held perfectly still, kept his voice gentle despite the urgency clawing at his chest, and spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "You're safe here. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West." The journey from barn to cabin through the howling Christmas Eve blizzard felt like crossing an Arctic wasteland. Jake's tall, sturdy frame battling against wind that tried to tear the unconscious woman from his arms as snow drove against his dark, heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat like frozen bullets. But he held her close against his chest, feeling how light she was, like a broken bird, her smaller form wrapped in that threadbare shawl that did nothing against Montana's merciless cold. And with each step through drifts that reached his knees, he could feel her life ebbing away, her breathing so shallow it barely misted in the frigid air. Inside his cabin, warmth hit them like a wall of blessed relief. The fire he'd banked before checking the barn still glowing with embers that cast dancing shadows on log walls, and Jake moved with the efficient urgency of a man who understood that minutes mattered when hypothermia had sunk its claws deep, carrying her to his bed near the hearth where heat concentrated most, her shivers rattling through bones beneath soaked fabric that clung to her delicate frame like ice, and he could see the dangerous blue tinge to her lips, the way her dark eyelashes fluttered against cheeks pale as fresh snow. He stoked the fire higher until flames roared and crackled, filling the cabin with golden light that chased away the shadows, then found dry clothes from his mother's old trunk, the same trunk that held memories of a woman who'd believed in helping lost souls. And he worked with respectful privacy behind a blanket screen he rigged between chair and bedpost, his hands steady despite the urgency clawing at his chest as he changed her into wool that hung loose on her smaller frame, but was blessedly warm and dry, the fabric carrying his mother's faint scent of lavender that somehow seemed fitting for this moment of sanctuary. He wrapped her in quilts his grandmother had stitched by hand decades ago, each stitch a prayer for warmth and comfort, placed her back near the fire where the heat could work its healing magic, and started heating broth in the iron pot his mother had used to nurse him through childhood illnesses, the familiar ritual bringing back memories of gentle hands and soft words that had made him believe in the power of care, freely given to those who needed it most. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness like a boat tossed by invisible waves, her breathing shallow and quick, sometimes murmuring words he couldn't quite catch that spoke of fear and desperation, fragments about debts and shame, and a man named Mason, whose very name seemed to make her shiver with more than cold. And Jake settled into his chair with rifle across his lap, not expecting trouble but knowing a man learned to stay ready, especially when protecting something precious, keeping the bedside lamp burning bright so she wouldn't wake in darkness, the golden glow making her look like something from a Renaissance painting, with her dark hair spread across his pillow and her face finally peaceful in sleep. Through the long night he watched over her with the same careful attention he'd learned caring for his dying sister 5 years back when fever took Sweet Mary because he'd been too proud to ask for help paying the doctor, too stubborn to admit their ranch was failing and they needed charity. And he'd held Mary's hand as she slipped away, while promising her ghost he'd never let pride cost another life. Too late then, but not too late now. And he coaxed warm broth between Elena's lips when she surfaced enough to swallow, changed the cool cloth on her forehead when fever spiked. Each time her breathing steadied, bringing him relief he hadn't known he was holding, each small improvement feeling like a victory against the Reaper who'd already claimed too many people he'd cared about. Dawn broke on Christmas morning with the storm still howling but with less fury, wind no longer trying to tear the roof from his cabin but still driving snow against windows like handfuls of rice thrown at a wedding. And when Jake felt eyes on him, she was truly awake this time, fever-bright eyes studying him with cautious intelligence from beneath dark hair that had dried in waves around her delicate face, taking in his imposing size, the rifle across his knees, the careful way he kept his distance, despite the intimacy of their situation, and when she tried to speak, her voice came out as barely a whisper, raw from cold and fear. He kept his voice gentle despite his size, telling her she was in his home, that she'd been half frozen in his barn, that he was Jake Sullivan, and she was safe now. Watching as she struggled to sit up and failed, her body still weak from the night's ordeal, but her spirit already fighting to regain control. "I'm Elena Martinez," she whispered, the name coming hard, as if she hadn't spoken it in weeks. And when he asked if she was married, the word widowed fell like a stone between them, heavy with pain that was still fresh after a year of grief. And Jake nodded, gave her space, poured coffee from the pot that had been warming by the fire and set it within her reach, telling her the storm wouldn't break for 3 more days by his reckoning, that when it did she could choose her path. But for now she was staying put whether she liked it or not, because no woman was going back out into that white hell on his watch. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just 2 souls taking each other's measure. And finally she spoke again, her voice growing stronger as hot coffee worked its magic, telling him how her husband Diego had died the previous year in a logging accident, how his brother Mason had appeared at the funeral claiming she owed debts for the burial and the land, demanding she work them off in ways that made her skin crawl, his hands wandering where they had no right to be while he spoke of family obligations and proper submission. And when she refused his advances, he'd told the town she was improper, that she'd been with other men while Diego was still alive, that she'd stolen money from the family business, lies that a respected man's word made truth against a widow's protests, because who would believe a grieving woman over an established rancher with political connections? Jake's hands curled into fists below the table where she couldn't see them, his jaw tightening as the picture formed of what had driven her into a blizzard on Christmas Eve, thinking maybe freezing would be mercy compared to Mason's demands. And he stood slowly, moved to the mantel, where he took down a small silver cross that had been his mother's, bringing it back and placing it on the table between them like a sacred promise, the metal still warm from the firelight that had been touching it all night. "This belonged to my mother," he said, his voice roughened by memory. "She died 2 years back, but she believed in sanctuary, that every soul deserves shelter from the storm, and you're under my roof now. Elena Martinez, which means you're under my protection, and nobody's taking you anywhere you don't choose to go." She picked up the cross with trembling fingers, held it like a talisman while asking why he would help someone he didn't know, and Jake met her eyes steadily, telling her he knew she was a woman who'd survived a powerful man's lies in a Montana blizzard, and that took more strength than most men he knew possessed, that he knew what it was like to fail someone who needed help and he wouldn't make that mistake twice, not when he had the power to offer shelter and safety to someone the world had abandoned. 3 days snowed in became an unexpected gift that transformed strangers into something deeper, something unnamed but undeniable. And Elena regained her strength quickly once the fever broke, helping with small things at first, washing dishes and folding blankets with the careful attention of a woman who understood the value of contributing rather than just receiving. But by the 3rd day, she'd reorganized his chaotic kitchen with gentle efficiency that made the cabin feel like a home instead of just a shelter, arranging his mother's dishes in ways that made sense, finding uses for forgotten corners and creating order from the comfortable chaos of a bachelor's existence. Jake found himself teaching her to make sourdough, their hands brushing in flour while he explained how his mother had started the starter 20 years ago and kept it alive through every harsh winter, feeding it like a pet and talking to it like an old friend. And Elena laughed for the first time since he'd found her, a sound like silver bells that made something warm unfurl in his chest. She read aloud from his mother's Bible by firelight while he carved wood, her voice soft and musical in the warm cabin air, bringing life to words that had been silent too long. And when he made her a small wooden angel for the mantel, carving delicate features that reminded him somehow of her own face, the first Christmas decoration his home had seen in years, she smiled with tears in her eyes. The first real smile he'd seen from her, transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. And she placed it next to his mother's cross like it belonged there, like maybe she belonged there too. "You're good with your hands," she observed, watching him work, and he admitted he'd had time to learn. Not much else to do out here alone. And when she asked how long he'd been alone, the answer came easier than it had in years, since his mother died. Since before that, really. Because loneliness had been his companion long before death made it official. But somehow in this storm-bound cabin with this brave, broken woman slowly healing by his fire, loneliness felt like something that belonged to his past rather than his future. And when she said his name softly in the lamplight, testing how it felt on her tongue, Jake Sullivan felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with the promise of warmth that might last longer than 3 days, longer than winter, maybe longer than either of them had dared to hope for, when the blizzard first drove them together into this unexpected sanctuary, where two damaged souls were slowly learning to trust again. The fourth morning dawned clear and brilliant, sunlight streaming through windows to reveal a world transformed by snow that stretched unbroken to the horizon, and Elena stood at the window watching Jake's tall figure moving through the drifts to check on his livestock. His dark coat and wide-brimmed hat stark against the white landscape, and when he returned with reports that the animals had weathered the storm well, she found the courage to tell him the rest of her story. The parts she'd been too ashamed to speak even in her darkest moments alone. How Mason had cornered her in the barn 2 weeks after Diego's funeral, his hands rough and demanding as he told her that widows needed protecting, that she owed the family more than money, that her body was part of the debt Diego had left behind, and when she'd fought him off, clawing at his face until he bled, he'd sworn to ruin her reputation so thoroughly that no decent person in 3 counties would believe a word she said. Jake's hands stilled on the coffee cup he'd been warming by the fire, his knuckles white with the effort of controlling rage that burned hotter than the flames in the hearth. And when he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet, the tone of a man making a promise that would be kept no matter the cost, telling her that no one would ever force her into anything again, that he'd see Mason buried before he let that man lay another finger on her. And Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of fear she'd carried so long it had become part of her breathing, because she could see in Jake's steady gaze that he meant every word, that his protection wasn't conditional on anything she could give him in return, but simply because he believed she deserved it. The storm broke on the 5th day with a suddenness that left them both standing in the doorway, squinting at sunlight so bright it hurt their eyes. But neither spoke of departure. Neither mentioned the clear roads that would now allow her to leave, because something had taken root between them that went deeper than shelter from weather, deeper than the gratitude of rescue. And Elena found herself moving through his cabin like it had always been her home, rearranging furniture to catch the morning light better, hanging his mother's good curtains that had been stored in the trunk, cooking meals that filled the small space with aromas of home and comfort that Jake hadn't experienced since childhood. Jake showed her his land when the snow settled enough for walking, his property stretching across rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen, and he talked about his dreams while they walked, how he planned to expand the herd, build a proper barn to replace the old one, maybe add rooms to the cabin if he ever had reason to house more than just himself. And Elena listened with growing wonder at the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of the future. This man who'd seemed so solitary, revealing depths of ambition and hope that made her heart race with possibilities she'd never dared imagine. He was patient when she stumbled in the deeper snow, his large hands steady on her elbow. And when she asked about the creek that wound through his property, he told her it ran year-round. Fed by mountain springs, perfect for irrigation and livestock, his voice carrying the pride of a man who'd built something lasting from nothing. And she found herself imagining vegetables growing in careful rows beside the water, children splashing in the shallows during summer heat, a life that seemed impossibly rich compared to the desperate existence she'd fled. Their attraction grew like wildfire during those golden afternoon hours, sparked by touches that lingered longer than necessary when he helped her over fallen logs, by glances that held more heat than the winter sun, by the way her breath caught when he stood close enough that she could smell the pine soap he used and feel the warmth radiating from his powerful frame. And she began to understand that what she'd felt during their storm-bound days wasn't just gratitude, but something far more dangerous and wonderful. The kind of wanting that could reshape a woman's entire world if she was brave enough to let it. The evenings became exercises in sweet torture as they sat by the fire, Elena mending his shirts with neat stitches that transformed torn work clothes into something approaching respectability, Jake reading aloud from books his mother had loved, his deep voice making poetry of simple words, and sometimes their eyes would meet across the small space and the air would thicken with unspoken longing, conversations trailing off into loaded silences that spoke louder than words about the need building between them, like pressure in a steam kettle. She began sleeping in his mother's room, the one he'd prepared for her when the storm broke, but some nights she could hear him moving restlessly in the main room, and she wondered if he lay awake, thinking about her the way she thought about him, imagining what it would feel like to have those large, careful hands touching her with something other than respectful distance, what it would be like to wake beside him instead of alone in a bed that smelled of lavender and old sorrows. Jake caught her watching him more than once as he worked around the cabin, splitting wood with powerful strokes that made muscles bunch and flex beneath his shirts, his dark hair falling across his forehead when he bent to stack the logs, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to smooth that hair back, to trace the strong line of his jaw with fingers that trembled just thinking about such intimate contact. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning, when Elena was kneading bread dough, flour dusting her hands and apron, and Jake returned from checking the horses to find her humming softly while she worked, sunlight streaming through windows to turn her dark hair to silk and illuminate the contentment in her face, and something in his chest cracked open like ice breaking in spring thaw because he realized he couldn't imagine his cabin without her presence anymore, couldn't picture mornings without her coffee and evenings without her gentle voice reading by firelight. And when she looked up to smile at him, flower on her cheek and happiness in her eyes, he knew he had to take the risk of asking for what he wanted more than his next breath. "Elena," he said, his voice rougher than intended, and she turned to face him fully, something in his tone making her hands still in the dough. "I know you came here running from one man's demands, and I don't want you to think I'm making demands of my own, but I need to ask you something, need to say something before I lose my courage." She wiped her hands on her apron, moved closer until she stood within arm's reach, her dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his pulse hammer in his throat. And when she nodded for him to continue, he took a breath that seemed to come from his boots and told her he didn't want her to leave when spring came, not because she owed him anything or because she had nowhere else to go, but because somewhere between that first night when he'd found her half frozen and this morning when he'd seen her making his house a home, he'd fallen in love with her courage, her kindness, the way she'd survived the worst humanity could offer, and still had gentleness left to give. "I'm asking you to stay not as my guest or my charity case, but as my partner. My wife if you'll have me. Because Elena Martinez, you've turned my survival into living. And I can't go back to just existing after tasting what it feels like to have someone to share dreams with, someone who makes even ordinary moments feel like gifts." Her answer came without words first, tears streaming down her cheeks, as she stepped closer until she could place her hands on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palms, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears, telling him she'd fallen in love with him too, with his strength that never threatened, his protection that never demanded payment, the way he'd given her safety and space to heal before asking for anything in return. And yes, she wanted to stay. Wanted to build something beautiful with him in this place that had become sanctuary and home, and the birthplace of a love she'd never thought she'd be brave enough to accept again. Their first kiss was gentle as snowfall, Jake's large hands framing her face like she was made of precious crystal, his lips soft against hers with a reverence that spoke of worship rather than conquest. And Elena felt something deep in her soul unfurl like flowers blooming after winter, every fear and shame falling away as she kissed him back with the passion of a woman who'd finally found her safe harbor. And when they broke apart, foreheads touching in the flour-dusted kitchen with sunlight blessing them both, she knew she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who'd saved her life and then taught her how to live it again. Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings, snowmelt feeding the creek that ran through Jake's property, while wildflowers pushed through patches of lingering snow like nature's own wedding decorations. And Elena stood on the cabin porch in a simple white dress that had belonged to Jake's mother, the fabric altered to fit her smaller frame by the gentle hands of Doris Winslow, their nearest neighbor, who'd become the closest thing to family either of them had left. The silver cross that had once symbolized sanctuary now resting against her throat as a symbol of faith in futures, built from love rather than fear, its familiar weight a reminder of how far they'd traveled from that terrifying Christmas Eve when Jake had first placed it in her trembling hands. Jake waited beside her in his Sunday best, the same dark coat and wide-brimmed hat he'd worn that night when he'd found her broken and hiding in his barn. But now his imposing frame radiated joy instead of solitude, his weathered hands steady as he held hers, while Pastor Matthews spoke words that would bind them not just legally but spiritually, creating something permanent from what had begun as temporary shelter. And Elena felt tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks as she looked up into the face of the man who'd saved her life, and then taught her how to live it again. His dark eyes soft with wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe she'd chosen to stay. Chosen him, chosen this life they were building together, from the ashes of their separate sorrows. The gathering was small but perfect. Neighbors who'd initially been suspicious of the mysterious woman Jake had taken in now standing as witnesses to a love that had transformed them both, their faces warm with genuine affection, as they watched two people who'd found healing in each other's arms. And Doris had insisted on making a 3-layer cake, despite Elena's protests that such extravagance wasn't necessary. While the church ladies had brought wildflowers gathered from the meadows beyond town, creating an altar of beauty on the rough wooden porch where Jake had first carried her to safety months ago, the same boards that had witnessed her first faltering steps back into the world of the living, now supporting her as she took the most important step of her life. When Pastor Matthews said, "You may kiss your bride," Jake did so with gentle reverence, his large hands cupping her face like she was made of precious crystal, his lips soft against hers with the same careful tenderness he'd shown that first morning when she'd awakened in his bed, but now without the barriers of fear and uncertainty that had kept them apart for so long. And Elena kissed him back with all the passion of a woman who'd finally learned to trust in happiness, to believe that good things could last, that love freely given wouldn't be twisted into obligation or punishment, but would grow stronger with each day they chose each other anew. The celebration continued until sunset painted the mountains purple and gold, neighbors sharing stories and laughter, while children played tag between the adults, and Elena moved among them all, like she'd been born to this role of hostess and friend, the shy, broken woman who'd hidden in the hayloft, transformed into someone radiant with confidence and belonging, accepting congratulations and wedding gifts with the grace of someone who'd learned that receiving kindness was as important as giving it. And Jake watched her with wonder in his eyes, marveling at how completely she'd healed, how thoroughly she'd claimed her place in this community that had once seemed ready to believe the worst about her simply because a powerful man had said it was so. Old Henrik brought his fiddle and played dancing tunes that had the younger folks spinning around the yard while the older generation clapped and called out encouragement. And Elena laughed with pure delight when Jake swept her into an impromptu waltz right there on the grass, his strong arms making her feel like she was floating as they turned under the gathering stars. And she thought about how different this was from her first wedding, which had been a somber affair overshadowed by Diego's family's disapproval of his choice to marry a woman with no dowry, how this celebration felt like a true beginning instead of a reluctant acceptance. Marshall Brennan arrived just as the last guests were preparing to leave, his official business casting a momentary shadow over the celebration, until he explained that he'd come with news that would interest the new Mrs. Sullivan, and Elena felt Jake's hand tighten protectively on her waist as the marshal dismounted and approached with the careful respect of a man who understood he was interrupting a sacred celebration, his badge catching the lamplight as he removed his hat in deference to the assembled company. But his words brought not threat but vindication, when he told them that Mason Martinez had been arrested 3 days ago in Helena on charges of fraud, extortion, and attempting to claim property not rightfully his through coercion and false accusations, his scheme finally unraveled by the testimony of brave women who'd refused to stay silent any longer. "Seems you weren't the first woman he tried this game with, Mrs. Sullivan," Marshall Brennan said, using her new name with the respect she'd been denied for so long, tipping his hat toward Elena with the deference due a respectable married woman, rather than the suspicion that had once followed her everywhere. "Your testimony when you reported his threats to the church ladies helped break the case wide open, gave other victims the courage they needed to come forward, and 4 other women from neighboring counties stepped up with similar stories, and widows who'd suffered his predation but been too afraid to speak until someone showed them it was possible to fight back and win." Elena swayed slightly as the full weight of vindication hit her. All charges cleared, her reputation restored, The lies that had driven her into a blizzard finally exposed as the fabrications of a predator who'd used his position and gender to prey on vulnerable women who had nowhere to turn for protection. And Jake steadied her against his side while she absorbed the reality that she was truly free, that the shadow of Mason's accusations would no longer follow her wherever she went, that she could build her new life without constantly looking over her shoulder for the past to catch up and destroy everything she'd found, that her children would grow up knowing their mother's name was spoken with respect rather than whispered with scandalous speculation. After the marshal left and the last neighbor disappeared down the road toward town, Jake and Elena stood alone on their porch in the gathering twilight, her white dress ghostly in the starlight while his dark coat made him a protective shadow beside her, and she leaned into his warmth while processing the day's revelations. The way justice had finally arrived to validate choices that had once seemed like desperate gambles taken by a woman with nothing left to lose. The knowledge that Mason would face consequences for his cruelty, giving her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. "It's really over," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder as she touched the ring Jake had placed on her finger that morning. His mother's band polished to a warm glow that caught the lamplight spilling from their windows. "Mason can't hurt me anymore. Can't hurt any woman anymore, and I'm free to be exactly who I want to be instead of constantly defending against who he claimed I was. Free to be your wife without shame or fear tainting everything we build together." Jake turned to face her fully, his large hands gentle as they framed her face, and told her she'd been free the moment she'd chosen to trust him instead of dying in that storm. That courage had been hers all along, even when she couldn't see it. That watching her reclaim her strength and dignity had been the greatest privilege of his life. Better than any gift he'd ever received or any dream he'd ever achieved on his own. Because loving her had taught him that the best parts of living came from sharing it with someone worthy of devotion, someone who made even ordinary moments feel like celebrations worth remembering. Summer brought changes that transformed their cabin from a bachelor's shelter into a proper home, Elena's garden flourishing beside the creek in neat rows of vegetables and herbs that would see them through the winter months, while Jake expanded his herd with profits from selling horses to the railroad. His reputation as a breaker of difficult animals bringing buyers from as far away as Denver, and their evenings were filled with the comfortable domesticity of two people building something lasting together, planning improvements to the property while sharing dreams that seemed more achievable every day, because they were working toward them as partners rather than struggling alone against an indifferent world. Elena's laughter became a regular sound in the mountains, silver, bright, and frequent, especially when Jake attempted to help with cooking and managed to burn even the simplest meals, creating disasters that filled their kitchen with smoke and sent them both into fits of giggles as they opened windows to clear the air. And she teased him about being able to gentle the wildest horses while being defeated by a pot of beans. But her eyes held only love when she cleaned up his culinary disasters and sent him back to work. He actually understood, like building the addition to their cabin that would house the children they both hoped would bless their union someday soon. His skilled hands creating rooms that echoed with the promise of little voices and running feet. The town fully accepted her now. Not just because the marshal's news had cleared her name, but because they could see the happiness that radiated from both Sullivans whenever they appeared together. The way Jake's eyes followed his wife with protective devotion, while Elena bloomed like a flower finally planted in good soil, contributing to church socials and community events with the confidence of a woman who knew her place was secure, who understood that love freely given had created roots deep enough to weather any future storms. And she found particular joy in helping other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances, offering the same sanctuary that Jake had given her to those who needed a safe haven while they figured out their next steps. October brought crisp mornings, and the first hint of winter's eventual return. Elena working in her garden to harvest the last of the vegetables, while Jake repaired fence lines and prepared for the seasonal rhythm that had once marked only survival, but now measured the passage of a life rich with purpose and connection. And it was during one of these peaceful mornings, while she was hanging laundry on the line behind their cabin and watching Jake work with a new colt in the paddock he'd built that spring, that Elena realized her monthly courses hadn't come for 2 cycles, that the subtle changes in her body weren't from the rich food and contentment of marriage but from something far more wonderful and terrifying, the promise of new life growing beneath her heart, like the most precious secret she'd ever carried. A tiny spark of humanity that would grow into the child they dreamed about during those long summer evenings when they'd planned the future rooms of their expanding home. She waited until evening to tell Jake, preparing his favorite supper of venison stew and fresh bread, while rehearsing words that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what she needed to share, her hands trembling slightly as she set the table with her mother-in-law's good china, the same plates that would someday feed their children family meals, filled with laughter and love. And when they'd finished eating and were sitting by the fire with coffee and the comfortable silence that came from knowing each other's thoughts, she took his calloused hand and placed it on her stomach, where new life was quietly beginning its miraculous journey, her eyes bright with tears of joy as she told him they were going to need a bigger cabin by next spring, that their family was already growing in the most fundamental way possible, that the child they'd both dreamed of was already becoming real beneath her ribs, a tiny heart beating its own rhythm while sheltered in the sanctuary of her body. Jake's reaction was everything she'd hoped and more, his eyes going wide with wonder as the full meaning of her words sank in, and then he pulled her into his arms and held her like she was made of starlight and promises, his voice breaking as he whispered her name and called her his grace, his miracle, the woman who'd brought him everything he'd never dared ask for from life. And when he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who understood he was holding his entire world in his arms, the future mother of his children, and the love that had transformed his solitary existence into something approaching paradise. His large hands gentle on her still flat belly, as if he could somehow communicate with the tiny life growing there. Let it know how desperately wanted it already was. That night they stood together on their porch in the cold October air, stars blazing overhead in the clear mountain sky, while inside their cabin the lamp burned steady as always, a beacon for any lost soul who might need sanctuary. And Elena asked him if he remembered that Christmas Eve night, when he'd found her hiding in the hayloft, convinced she was dying, and that death might be merciful compared to the life Mason had planned for her. And Jake said he remembered every detail, every moment, from the terror in her eyes to the trust that had slowly replaced it over the days that followed, how holding her unconscious form in his arms that night had awakened something in him he'd thought died with his sister, the fierce need to protect and nurture and fight for someone else's happiness above his own. "I was so wrong about Mercy," Elena said, leaning into his warmth while one hand rested protectively over the new life growing inside her, the baby who would never know a world without love and safety, who would grow up hearing the story of how their parents had found each other in a storm and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate sorrows. "I thought freezing in that storm would be kindness, but this is mercy. You are mercy. This life we've built from nothing but faith and stubborn hope. This child we're going to raise in a house full of love instead of fear. This is what grace actually looks like when you're brave enough to receive it instead of running from it." Jake kissed the top of her head and told her they'd both received grace they hadn't thought they deserved. But that was the whole point of grace. The way it came not because people earned it but because love itself demanded that broken things be made whole, that lost souls find their way home, and that two people wounded by life's cruelties could choose to heal together instead of suffering alone. And as the first snow of winter began to fall around them, gentle and peaceful this time instead of the violent blizzard that had brought them together, Elena felt the baby stir beneath her heart and knew that the storm which had nearly killed her had actually been the beginning of everything beautiful her life would ever hold. That sometimes destruction was just grace wearing a disguise, arriving in the form of wind and snow and desperation to drive two people toward a love that would last longer than any storm, stronger than any threat, and deeper than either of them had imagined possible when they were still just strangers, sharing sanctuary in a cabin where the lamp burned bright against the darkness, promising warmth and safety, and the kind of forever that began with whispered words in a hayloft. "You're safe here."